Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about interfaces. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, would you say that it is the correct thing to do to implement a class from an interface when it is not extensible or only has one implementation just so that it can be used for mocking in tests? So if I understand the root question, should you use an interface regardless of whether or not the class has any extensions or any other implementations or anything like that? It's literally just a one-to-one mapping between the interface and the class, and the purpose in this situation basically being that you should use the interface in order to do mocking. Well, I would say this. So the practical side of me says that no, of course not. Like, why would you do that? Because if you only have every one implementation of a class, then an interface is not strictly necessary. And I would even go as far as to say that I'm not 100% sure why you would use, there are a lot of languages and a lot of libraries that I don't know about, but for the most part, in all of the various flavors of mocking libraries and stuff like that that I've seen, there isn't necessarily, like, there is a pattern for it for sure. It's one of the favorite use cases for interfaces when you're doing tests and stuff like that, to just use the interface and then get a stub implementation. In some languages such as, say, C# and so forth, there are mocking libraries that are very well suited to use an interface in order to, like, using an interface for that, right? But the thing that is curious to me a little bit is that, like, because you don't necessarily need an interface in order to mocking. You can use a class. Absolutely, that's based on my experience at the very least. Because usually when you're dealing with, I'm assuming now you're doing object-oriented programming or something like that, like the interface is injecting something, or rather the interface gets a stub implementation and then it gets injected somehow into some consumer somewhere. I'm guessing, I can't really picture a scenario where you have to use an interface because you have no way of using the actual thing. There are situations for that in C# that I've noticed and so forth, but if it's just your own class, usually you don't have to do it, in my opinion, at the very least. Like, I mean, if you really want to bend my arm here, like, you could do, like, because I mean, you can mock the class itself. You could make like a stub implementation, like use inheritance and just extend that thing, and then do whatever you want, right? So to me, there are a few situations, like, there are ways where you don't need an interface in order to do mocking and stubbing. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's the practical part of me saying that no, of course not. Why would you do that? But the experience that I have to sort of, I need to tell you about this as well. And this is not necessarily always going to be true, but it is something that I have seen many times. And it touches on a bigger thing, I argue. And that is that when you work, or when you do anything, like, usually I say that a software developer is in different mind spaces when they're working on various tasks. Like, you think about various things. So for example, if you're focusing really, really hard on your current story, it may not necessarily be the case that you have the mental flexibility or bandwidth or stuff like that. Maybe you're so laser focused on the thing you're doing that you're sort of missing the whole picture. And this happens to me as well, guys. It's so common. Like, you focus so heavily on the thing that you are looking at right now that you miss the bigger picture. And it's not because you're not able to see the bigger picture. It's just that right now your mind is very focused on the task that you're dealing with. So it's really tricky for you to sort of think about the bigger perspective and figure out if the thing you're doing right now is the right thing or not. Because one thing that you've heard me say probably in a few occasions is that what I call shim programming. So for a lot of software developers, when they get stressed and they have, like, problems with deadlines or bugs, or there's a production issue or something like that, what they usually will do is that they throw away all quality thinking usually, and, like, they sort of let go of their best practice because now there's some pressure on them. And so what they go into is shim programming, like, where the goal now is not to write good software. It is to work to just solve whatever issue you have at basically any cost. And shim programming is a term I use to sort of to create a term for how software developers behave when the code is so messy and so difficult to work with, that it's easier to just try to figure out a way to put in their feature or fix their fix without actually fixing the whole thing. Or like, it's a little bit like those I can't remember, like the towers with all the bricks. You're trying to pull bricks or put in bricks in this situation without tipping the whole thing over, basically. And that mindset is something that creeps up on you. And so what I have found more than once is that when people start using, like, they sort of let go of the idea of always having an interface and just using a class directly, is that at the time they only have one implementation, but over time they start adding complexity and features, and like they start coupling without really thinking about it. They're adding more and more stuff to their class implementation, and then at some point they realize that, well, now they actually have that problem that is the whole point of having an interface. Like, they have these very strongly coupled classes that sort of live all across the place. It's almost like when you're at your house or in your home, you start putting dishes, like dirty dishes in certain places, and you start, you're basically going about your day. You don't really think about how clean your apartment is or your house until you actually take a step back and realize, oh shit, this doesn't look all that nice, I need to clean it up. That is something that happens very, very easily. And so that's why I usually tell people that just use the interface immediately. And the reason being, not because necessarily at this exact moment this is the right way of doing it, or like that there's any practical thing. It's just that you don't get into a situation like that, because it's super, super easy, and I see it very, very often. It's actually something that I would go as far as to say that is, if you can foresee those sorts of things, it's almost a little bit like it's not over-engineering per se. It's more a question of, do you know yourself? And if you can do this really, really well, you're probably going to be a pretty good technical leader someday. Do you know the work and the way that people do work so well that you know what's going to be a really good setup so that they fall into what we call the pit of success? Because when you're in that state, when you're just trying to do your work and story mode and so forth, it's very hard for you to, or not everybody has that ability to just think about all these things while they're focusing on something else. But if those things are already there, that's the thing that I usually tell people. It's much better for a software project to have a code structure in the source code or whatever, like you have set up certain guardrails that are not intrusive. They're not stopping you from doing, getting into your flow state or anything like that. It's just that it creates a path of least resistance, so that you on average go down the right route, even if you're not thinking about it. Really good frameworks and good tools that we use in libraries, they are really, really good at that stuff. They sort of help you by the design of the framework or the way of doing something. It's designed so that it makes it easier for you to, when you're focusing on something completely different, to not make those sorts of mistakes. So what I want you to take away from this is that, no, I would say that you don't need to use an interface. I've had conversations back and forth with people about this. It's a divided topic, so I'm not going to say that one is right or the other. All I can say is that my practical side is saying, no, you don't need to. But at the same time, I kind of want to go and say, what is the cost? Like, it's not that much of a cost. And in this situation, I argue that I can say I can be a little bit ahead of the curve. I've said this before, don't over-engineer, don't try to think into the future, stuff like that. But if we're talking about an interface, which is, if we in terms of, like, my favorite term, how much of an investment is this? Is this disposable code? I would argue that an interface is a pretty disposable piece of code. Like, there's very little you can. I can't really think of a scenario where you would lock yourself in by using an interface. So if you use that interface, then at the very least, I will argue you are a little bit secured against that thing I've been saying to you, like where you make a decision in the code base, such as just using a direct implementation of a class, which is supposed to be an anti-pattern, and on average it is, due to this reason I'm talking about. And then, because you know that in this exact moment in time that's fine, then you do it. And then 5-6 months later, or like a year or so forth, you find out that thing grew just organically, just because nobody questioned it, nobody like, because you think in your mind, and that's why I tell people it's so dangerous with too many abstractions up front, because you think at this moment when you're creating that abstraction that, well, in the future if this changes too much we're gonna like, you know, do all the right things and stuff like that. Probably not. Probably not. You can basically assume that if your idea is that you're making implementation right now that someone has to undo or like in some way like have like the foresight to split into a nicer setup if the situation changes, don't assume that that's going to happen. It's a little bit like knowing yourself. You know, if you tell yourself that you're never going to eat candy or like you're going to get into shape and so forth and so forth, ask yourself, really, are you really 100% sure that you have the strength of will at all times and you have like the energy to go and work out and all of that sort of stuff? That requires discipline. And if we think about how many people have troubles just going out for a walk or stuff like that, self-discipline is a tricky thing to bet on. So that's why I usually say try to set things up so that the person you are right now is not going to fuck things up, like that the future state is going to be messed up because right now you're doing something that is pretty easy, but over time you also have to understand that you're probably going to see other people make the same sort of shortcuts and stuff like that. So if you do a nice job now when it basically doesn't cost you anything and it doesn't really pose any risk, it's a pretty good, a very light over optimization or over engineering. Have a great day.